welcome everyone here today. For those that have come long distances, thank you very much. We're here today to give voice to the families of the children in New South Wales that are currently up for forced adoption. We're fortunate to have a number of people here that are well informed on all sides of the situation, and there'll be several speakers. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. I'm going to go through the issues and then I'm going to offer some solutions. And then we've got some other guest speakers as well. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Mary Moore. By profession, I'm a registered intensive care nurse. I'm a forgotten Australian. I worked for the Commission for Children in Queensland for a couple of years, and through that work I discovered that the current children in care situation is as bad or perhaps even worse than when I was in care decades ago. And so that set me a bit on a pilgrimage, and since then I've been advocating for children and families. So I'll start. Now, the Australian governments are forcibly removing more children per head of population than any other Western nation, and the statistics are on that banner. New South Wales is responsible for this shocking statistic, with nearly half of all children in care removed by this state. This is not a title to be proud of. It's one of great shame and causing immense harm and trauma to vulnerable children and families that will impact for the rest of their lives and into future generations. Worldwide evidence for best practice proves that forced removal of children and forced adoptions do not ensure a safe, stable and loving home for life for vulnerable children. And the outcomes are far better for children, family and society when they are supported to remain safely at home, and it's also far cheaper in the long run. Sadly, Australia copied the failed United States and United Kingdom systems whereby they grab a child and run with that child and place that child with strangers. And for most children that are taken, they never see their extended families again. And if you have any doubts at all that children are being stolen in this state on a daily basis, I refer you to the Senate inquiry into children in out-of-home care website to read submission number 27. And we're fortunate because the author of that submission is here, and he's going to speak after me to explain the process. He's a solicitor, one of the very few that works very hard to try and defend families in the care courts. No one should have the power to take children from their parents by force with armed police when they have not committed any crime and without evidence. Forced removals are still happening as a first resort with no investigation taking place, no warnings to parents and no help or support offered. Forcibly removing children is the most drastic, costly, intrusive act a government can carry out. Legal aid solicitors are underfunded for care and protection matters, resulting in inadequate and at times no legal defence for parents by their own appointed solicitors. And a recent trend is emerging where parents qualify for legal aid but then have that grant refused on the grounds that the case has no merit. So traumatised parents are forced to try and defend themselves and fight for their children's lives against unlimited Crown lawyers because an office clerk has prejudged their case. That is not justice. Appeals are not funded by legal aid, and nor are most applications for restoration for children. So the children of the poor are stolen for the term of their childhood because their parents can't afford a good solicitor. Sadly, our governments have failed to learn the painful and destructive lessons of the past and have rapidly escalated the rate of child stealing in the last decade on the ludicrous probability that it's better to take a child because they might suffer a risk of harm at some time in the future if left with family, while at the same time failing to acknowledge the far greater evidenced harm to children that are forcibly removed and placed in care, especially with strangers. Saying sorry for past abuse and failures is meaningless, while children are still being stolen Deaths and abuse of children in care is still happening at an alarming rate, and it's still being covered up in Australia's multi-billion-dollar child protection industry that caters to the whims of the profiteering stakeholders, not our children, and certainly not families. Yet again, New South Wales and Victoria failed to provide the statistics on how many children were abused in care last year, but what we do know is that last year there were 500 reports of significant risk of harm to children in care in New South Wales, and those reports had come in for the 2 years prior and they hadn't even been investigated, and that was announced by the Director General Coots Trotter in a media interview. There is no transparency or accountability with state child protection departments that refuse to publish the data for children who die and are abused in care. And this sets the example for the NGOs and continues the cover-ups that have always been a part of the secret child protection industry, as evidenced daily in the current Royal Commission. They must be forced by law to publish the data of children who are abused and die in care, including the alarming suicide rate of children and their parents torn apart and destroyed by the current alienating tactics used by the child protection workers. We believe it is in the best interest of the public to know about the breaches of law, the human rights violations, and the abuse of children and families by our governments. But unfortunately, the right to information laws are continually denied to us in care and protection matters. New South Wales is arguably the worst state of all. It leads the nation with the incredibly high numbers of children in care, and it is legislating neoliberal social eugenics policies such as forced adoptions to dispose of the children they've taken. Forced adoptions of children in care has never stopped in Australia. It has just been hidden from the public and enacted in secret. And it's now time that this human rights atrocity was outlawed. But instead, Prue Goward and Deborah Lee Furness, financed by James Packer, got together to do a deal that would benefit all of their agendas, violating the human rights and condemning another generation to the very same evidenced ongoing lifetime trauma caused by forced adoptions on every vulnerable child in care in this state and their families. Child abuse does not discriminate. It is found in every class of society. Domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health issues, disability, emotional, physical and sexual abuse, and even neglect span all classes of Australian society. But it's only the marginalised, the disadvantaged and the poorer class, including the homeless, that have their children forcibly removed because the rich can afford to buy justice. Deborah Lee Furness has announced several times last month that 11,000 babies were removed from their mothers last year in Australia. These alarming figures show that supply is underway for the well-off childless couples that want other people's children, and so is another stolen generation. We need laws that ensure no newborn babies can be forcibly removed without a court hearing attended by both parties and evidence of abuse or neglect. The decision to remove a baby, especially, and even a child, must be made by a magistrate after a hearing of evidence, not by a caseworker as happens now. We now have babies being taken from the maternity wards in this state every day and placed under 18-year final orders in less than 50 days with no defence afforded to parents. Prue Goward's dangerous social eugenics legislation was ratified in October last year, making forced adoptions legal and the first priority for children in care. And since November, numerous parents are being served with forced adoption applications while still fighting hard to have their children returned to their care. In an unjust system, they are unable to afford the legal costs required. The forced adoption agenda is being spread around the nation by the rich, powerful and influential childless couples wanting other people's children. Forced adoption of all children in care in New South Wales can now take place without a parent's knowledge, let alone their consent. And for children under 2 within 6 months and those over 2 within 12 months. which is a grossly inadequate and unjust time frame for families. The latest propaganda is the concept that open adoption will make it all okay. Well, Deborah Lee Furness is a very good example of how open adoption is abused. She procured her oldest adopted son from the child protection system in the United States of America on an open adoption contract. And she broke all the rules by her own admission in an interview with Andrew Denton. Just 1 year after the adoption of her son, Deborah Lee Furness violated that open adoption contract and she cut her son's mother off completely. His mother, like so many others before her and after her, committed suicide, arguably caused by the grief and loss of her son and the selfishness of the adoptive parent who wanted someone else's child entirely to herself. Just like Deborah Lee Furness closed her open adoption contract after 1 year, so will others, because the adoptive parents hold all the power. It's not about the child for them, it's about the infertile people wanting a child of their own. You just have to view any of the pro-adoption chat rooms on the internet and you'll get all the evidence you need right there. We already have long-term guardianship orders which provide all the security that a child needs in a loving home. If they can't be restored to families, adoption only serves those that can't have children of their own. Yet fame, fortune, money and power have allowed Deborah Lee Furness to run a campaign to market all children in out-of-home care for forced adoptions, when arguably many of these children have been stolen from their families. Most have families that love them, and adoption should be for orphans, not children who have families that love them and want restoration but can't afford the legal fees. Prue Goward and now Tony Abbott are only listening to the pro-adoption lobbyists, the well-off that want other people's children as it suits these politicians who make the laws, because they can save money by reducing support services, by taking poor people's children and giving them to strangers for life because they've got a nicer house and more money in the bank.
Not our children.
While we could not achieve a response from Prue Goward or Tony Abbott, Deborah Lee Furness has open access to them and the media. Tony Abbott is now supporting her adoption agenda because it suits his own neoliberal agenda to reduce services. There's no legal definition for the best interests of the children. In state jurisdictions, the term was first used by Adolf Hitler for his own master eugenics plan, a term that is now used and abused to mean whatever the dominant and powerful want it to mean. Until the forced removal of children by this state is a fair and just process based on evidence, no stolen children in care should be forcibly adopted when they have families who love them fighting for their return. Australia has had more than 80 inquiries into children in state and territory care in the last 160 years. All have evidence that the system is a failure, but most of the recommendations were never implemented to fix the failures. And we are hopeful that the current Senate inquiry into out-of-home care will have a better result. Only 2 submissions have had any media attention from the nearly 100 published so far on the inquiry website. Most advocate, as we do, for family preservation because it's evidence-based practice. But unless it is mandated in law, it will never happen, because the respective departments do not work with families, they work against them. And unless they are made to work with families by law and trained in how to work with families, it just won't happen. I sit in meetings with child protection workers as a support person for families, and I have yet to observe one worker that knows how to even talk to families, let alone work with them. And most sessions I attend end up as a mediation session.
Unqualified.
For all of us that have had the lived experience of the failed child protection industry, we know that lack of accountability is the major factor for its failure. While our governments talk of supporting families to stay together and only taking children as a last resort, in practice those principles are being ignored because there are no laws that compel the child protection departments to support families. Only laws that support governments to forcibly remove children without any evidence, just a concern or opinion, as no evidence is required in the secret care courts. The financial facts evidence this very clearly. Only around 10% of funding nationally is spent on family support, 30% is spent on solicitors and legal costs, and the remaining 60% is spent on out-of-home care costs. It's time to scrap the failed child protection systems and secret care courts run by the states and territory governments, and for the Australian federal government to take over jurisdiction of our vulnerable children. We need new federal legislation that incorporates evidence-based practice for family preservation, laws that are fair and just for every child, no matter where they live in Australia, where evidence of a crime of abuse or neglect is required before a child is removed, and the human rights are protected with independent accountability to ensure integrity and the highest standards that are required to actually protect children. Less than 5% of parents who have had their children removed and placed in out-of-home care have been convicted of criminal abuse or neglect of their children, and they are dealt with through the criminal jurisdictions. Do not forcibly remove any child unless there is evidence sufficient to warrant a charge of criminal abuse or neglect. In all other cases, use the 30% now wasted on legal fees and costs to intensively support families to remain safely together, as no crimes have been committed.
And we will expose them.
At the very least, the secret care courts must be open to the public scrutiny, and the rules of evidence must apply, with parents given the presumption of innocence until proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, like any other jurisdiction in Australia. And parents must be given equal access to legal representation funded at the same rate as child protection departments, in keeping with human rights and the right to be treated equally before the law.
Yes.
All cases must be independently audited in consultation with families for restoration, especially in cases where children have been taken without evidence, where laws have been breached, and for a possible future risk of harm, which never acknowledges the harm done to a child from forced removal and life in care under the current failed systems. As each child is restored, funds are available to help and support families to remain safely together instead of removing their children, as restoration and family preservation will rapidly reduce the numbers of children in out-of-home care, as has occurred overseas where family preservation models are enshrined in law and practice, and those funds will then be available to implement prevention of child abuse and neglect programs nationwide. Within a decade, massive savings will be achieved. We will have stronger families and better protection of children that will continue into future generations and be in the best interests of children, their families and all of Australia. Child protection workers are not a registered profession in Australia. Unlike all other professions, they have no governing body to establish and mandate codes of practice, conduct, or even base levels of education and training. There is no external board monitoring their performance to protect the public from the harm their opinions and misconduct are doing to children and families every day. No one is holding these unregistered caseworkers accountable in an environment of secrecy, yet they have more power than any other profession in Australia. As a registered nurse, I am held accountable for all of my actions by my governing body, AHPRA, as are all other health and medical professions. And from the conduct that I have personally witnessed with child protection workers, if I treated patients and their families the same way, I would be deregistered, struck off and lose my career. We urgently need mandatory national registration for all child protection workers so an independent governing body can hold them accountable for their misconduct and abuse of children in care and their families. Unregistered caseworker opinions are made without adequate investigation, as evidence is not required in the secret care courts. So parents are denied justice because a caseworker has failed to adequately investigate the truth of allegations or outright lied in their affidavits. I am yet to read an unregistered caseworker's affidavit, and I've read hundreds, if not thousands, that does not contain defamation of parents, false allegations, and outright lies. And this is how and why so many children are stolen in New South Wales. There is no external complaints mechanism in the Australian child protection industry, so evidence complaints are not being investigated by anyone but themselves, and the department is not held to account for their criminal misconduct when dealing with vulnerable families, and abuse of children in their care by anyone. Failures are being ignored and covered up. We urgently need a national independent complaints mechanism empowered with both investigative and prosecutorial powers, where parents and children can go with their evidence complaints of abuse, misconduct and crimes being committed against them by the child protection industry every day to force accountability.
Now.
Cases are documented as substantiated, not on evidence, but on the opinion of a caseworker. So all of the data that refers to substantiated cases is extremely flawed. Over 60% of the approximately 50,000 children currently in care were forcibly removed for emotional harm and neglect. The high numbers of emotional harm are for children exposed to domestic violence. So start protecting the victims, remove the violent perpetrators, not the children, and stop closing domestic violence support services. The high numbers of neglect cases are due mainly to poverty. So help the families out of poverty. Don't steal their children. And this illustrates that there are at least 30,000 stolen children currently in care that should have received help and support to remain safely with their families. Restoration of these stolen children must be a priority of government. NGOs and other stakeholders must not be funded by child protection to reduce corruption. I have seen case after case where the department manipulates stakeholders to get the outcome that they want and threaten to withdraw funding if they don't get it. And this perverts the course of justice. There must be a legally binding contract that states what parents have to do to get their children back, and when they've completed all that has been asked of them, their children must immediately be returned. I have seen case after case where parents have done everything asked of them and they still don't get their children back.
Everything.
Mandatory reporting laws are actually killing children because it is like trying to find a needle in a haystack when there are over 100,000 reports of children at risk and less than 30% of cases are ever cited, let alone assessed by a child protection worker. Queensland has recently introduced a milder form of mandatory reporting whereby a family at risk can be referred to a family support agency rather than the Child Protection Department if the risk of harm is not significant. Unfortunately, there's no legal or even clear definition of what significant risk of harm actually means.
That's right.
So we need more education and training, and we need some legal definitions.
Now.
Mandatory prosecution for any person knowingly making a false or misleading risk of harm report to child protection authorities. Currently, anyone making a report is protected by both civil and criminal prosecution, and this would not only give families some protection against false allegations, but also reduce the amount of notifications by deterring false, malicious and vexatious reports. We need laws that mandate placements with extended family, as that is not happening enough, and suitable extended family are being overlooked. But also, we need to have a legal clause where parents must also have the right to approve of that kinship placement to ensure their child is not placed in an adversarial situation that will sever the bond between the child and parent as commonly occurs now. The failed policy of child stealing by governments has to stop. Families must be supported to stay together when no crime has been committed. No longer can governments plead ignorance. The damage to children taken from their families and placed with strangers, either fostered or forcibly adopted, is horrendous and it's lifelong. The damage to parents has proven irreparable as it's passed down to subsequent generations. The only people benefiting in this multi-billion-dollar child protection industry are the profiteering stakeholders, many of whom are currently before the Royal Commission for their past and ongoing abuse of vulnerable children. Without accountability, this abuse will continue and current governments will have no defence when they are made to account for their abuse of another stolen generation. In conclusion, let me say, adoption is for orphans, not children who have families that love them. It's absolutely un-Australian and a violation of human rights that must be outlawed. I now call on George.